What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 155 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about another installment of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen series. This is Century, Part 1, 1910, by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill. This is from Top Shelf Productions and Knockabout, and this is Part 1 in a trilogy where the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is trying to stop the birth of the Antichrist, and trying to stop him from causing the apocalypse and the end of the world. And this particular volume draws very heavily from the Threepenny Opera, with characters like Mac the Knife and Pirate Jenny, and specifically it ties those elements to other pieces of fiction that you wouldn't initially think would actually be connected to the Threepenny Opera. For example, Pirate Jenny here, she is actually the daughter of Captain Nemo. Now, in the original Jules Verne novels, Captain Nemo did not have a family, but in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen universe, we've known for a little while that he does have a family, and we see here that his daughter is actually the character Pirate Jenny. Her real name is Janny, but when she gives it to a guy, he mishears it as Jenny. And then the Black Freighter that is part of Alan Moore's The Watchmen and is also part of the Threepenny Opera, that is the Nautilus that Pirate Jenny takes over at the end of this book. I'm spoiling stuff a little bit, but this book is several years old, so I think it's okay to spoil a little bit of stuff. So this book is where the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen lost me as a reader for a really long time, or a little while anyway, and then I came back to it and then I regretted it after that. This is where I realized that Alan Moore has definitely fallen a little bit since he became really famous in the 80s. He's been writing since the early 80s, but he really became famous in the mid-80s with The Watchmen, and I think that The Watchmen is very nearly a masterpiece. But then you look at some of his later work, and it just seems like he's not nearly as potent of a writer as he used to be. And specifically, I want to talk about his use of rape as a subplot in most of his stories that he writes. It's really incredible how often he goes to that well in his stories. So you look at The Watchmen, there is a rape that is part of the backstory of several of these characters, and I feel like in that story, it was given the proper weight that it deserved, and it was handled very delicately, or at least as delicately as that can be handled in a story. You had this had a major impact on several of the characters. Two of the minor characters and two of the leading characters were very heavily impacted by this event in the story. It wasn't just something that happened and then, haha, we're going to make light of it and then we're going to move on. And that's kind of how it has happened in all of these League of Extraordinary Gentlemen books. And it's been a lot more present than what I ever realized until I was rereading these books recently. So in Volume 1, you have these guys in an opium den who try to rape Mina Murray, and then Alan saves her, and then we don't really mention that ever again. And then later, when they're recruiting Griffin, the Invisible Man, he is raping girls in this boarding school, underage girls, and then we don't really mention that again. We just kind of move past it. Okay, now Griffin is part of the League, and we're not going to bring that up that he was raping underage girls. And then in Volume 2, we have Griffin attacks Mina, and he doesn't actually rape her, but she later compares it to a rape. She says that he might as well have raped her, and that does kind of have an impact on the story. It definitely has an impact on how Mr. Hyde acts later in that story, and it also influences Alan and Mina to go on their own separate quest, separate from Mr. Hyde and Nemo at that part of the story, but really it seems more like a plot device than an actual character moment in that story. And then later, famously, we have Mr. Hyde. He rapes the Invisible Man in a very violent, very disgusting scene, and again, this is played for comedy. It's not played with the sense of weight and gravity that it deserves, and in the way that it was played in The Watchmen, where it was played very seriously, and it wasn't a laughing matter. Then you get to The Black Dossier, where James Bond attempts to rape Mina, and that also probably doesn't rub a lot of people the right way, because it's James Bond, and a lot of people like James Bond, and very clearly Alan Moore does not. He doesn't think very highly of many 20th century characters in fiction, and so that's a double whammy right there. But then again, Alan saves her, and she kind of also saves herself also, but that's a near rape that basically is just there as kind of a middle finger to fans of James Bond and the character of James Bond himself. And then you get to this book right here, where Pirate Jenny, she has no desire to follow in her father's footsteps and pilot the Nautilus and be the captain of the ship. She doesn't want a life of a pirate, she just wants to form her own life, and then she goes to this really squalid inn, and she becomes a cleaning girl girl, and that's kind of the plot of Pirate Jenny. And then she gets gang raped by everyone who's in the inn, and then she signals the Nautilus, and the Nautilus comes, and it basically kills everyone in the docks. And I don't really like this. It's basically just a really lazy way of getting this character from point A to point B. And yes, this does have an impact on this character, but this is a character that we won't see again for a little while. We will very briefly see Pirate Jenny at the very beginning of the next volume, and then after that we get to see Nemo's legacy sporadically throughout these books, and then after the conclusion of the Century storyline, we get an entire trilogy of stories about Janny Dakar in her own trilogy. So we do get to see this character a little bit more on down the line, but in this particular book, this feels like Alan Moore couldn't find a very clever way of getting this character from a point where she has no desire to follow in her father's footsteps to the point where she wants to be exactly like her father, and as one of her father's old henchmen says, she's even worse than her father, and they're laughing about it, saying, you know, it's good to be a pirate, it's good to have a captain once again. And it feels like Alan Moore can't find a good way to get this character to that point logically and organically, so he falls back on the old rape subplot, which he has used quite a bit in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and quite a bit in his fiction in general, and it just feels really lazy. Now, admittedly, rape is a part of the Pirate Jenny song in the Three-Penny Opera. That is very heavily implied to have happened to the character of Pirate Jenny, and then she calls the ship the Black Freighter with the skull on its masthead, and then she says, kill them now or later, and then that's the plot of the song. So, yeah, he's taking inspiration from that song, and he's incorporating it into this more or less brand new character who's connected to Captain Nemo, but it still feels very lazy. I wouldn't even think twice about it if we didn't already have half a dozen other examples of rape or almost rape in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But since it has been such a huge part of this series up until now, it felt very lazy, and it felt like Alan Moore was always just going to that well anytime he was in a sticky point in his story. Like, I can't figure out what I'm going to do next, so I'll just have somebody rape this character, and then that's good enough excuse, if you will, for her to signal the Nautilus and bring it to slaughter everyone. I didn't like that, and that was a huge reason why I stopped reading the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen books after I bought this one brand new. Having said that, now that I've read through all the others, I do think that this one makes a little bit more sense and is a little bit more understandable than some of the others that we've had in this series. For example, Jimmy Bond trying to rape Mina Murray. I don't think that that one works as well. Yes, James Bond was a misogynist and he slept with a lot of women, but if you go to the source material, he never actually raped anyone. There were times where it was very questionable in the movies, but that's not the same thing as the source material, which it's very clear that Alan Moore has a problem with the novels. And then, for example, The Invisible Man and Mr. Hyde, those are examples in the original series that I don't think worked as well as Alan Moore thought that they did. I don't necessarily think that making the Invisible Man a serial child rapist is a good idea unless you have him be an actual villain of the series, which later they did, but for a while he was an ally of the League and nobody even questioned his activities. So I think that this is probably one of the least reprehensible examples of this happening in the series, but still, whenever it starts to pile up, this one ended up just being the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, I've talked a whole lot about that, and that's really just one part of this story, so I'll talk a little bit about the rest of it. Like I said, this is the beginning of a trilogy where the League is trying to stop the rise of the Antichrist, who is going to destroy the world, and really, this volume isn't very good on that front. Basically, the only plot that actually matters in this volume is the Three-Penny Opera stuff with Pirate Jenny / Janny Dakar becoming the captain of the Nautilus. All of the stuff with this cult that's trying to create this Moonchild, all of that is basically just set up for stuff that's going to happen later on in the series. Basically, everything that happens here that doesn't have anything to do with Janny Dakar is basically just a waste of time and space, and it doesn't really get us anywhere. All of our characters find out about this thing called the Moonchild, including our bad guys. They actually get the idea of creating the Moonchild from our good guys who come to confront them about it in kind of a self-fulfilling paradox type situation. But as far as the subplot stuff here that doesn't have anything to do with Janny Dakar, all of that is kind of just a waste of time. And I think if you are reading these League of Extraordinary Gentlemen books, you probably won't like this one as much as you'll like some of the others where more stuff actually happens and it feels like our characters are actually more important in their own series. You read this one, Mina and the rest of the League, they feel like second secondary characters in their own story. Janny feels more important here than any of our title characters. So this one is not one that I can wholeheartedly recommend unless you are just a huge fan of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, or maybe you're a huge fan of the Three Penny Opera. If you are, you will probably enjoy a lot of the references here that went over my head. I was just very vaguely familiar with stuff like Pirate Jenny and Mac the Knife and stuff like that, and connections of that being made to the Whitechapel murders in the late 1800s. All that stuff is stuff that if you're a fan of history and you're a fan of that sort of thing, you will probably enjoy this more than I did, but that's true of just about all of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen books. I don't think there's any of them where I could say that I am an expert on any of the things that Moore and O'Neill are referencing in these books. But overall, I would say that this one doesn't really get a thumbs down necessarily, but it also doesn't get a thumbs up either. It's just kind of middle of the road. I think some of the later stuff was a little bit better, and I think some of the earlier stuff was definitely better. So overall, those are my thoughts on the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Century, Volume 1, 1910. That's all that I have today, and tomorrow I'll be talking about another book. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.